the title of our presentation is Helping Your Child with ADHD Succeed at Home. So we're going to, as the title suggests, we're going to focus primarily on interventions and treatment to help children who have ADHD in their home or family environments. Neither Dr. Proctor nor I have any financial conflicts of interest to disclose. And just a brief overview. So our main goal is to talk about the role of what we call psychosocial intervention. You'll also hear this referred to as behavioral intervention. So we're going to talk about what that type of intervention looks like for youth with ADHD. We're going to talk about the principles, the behavioral change principles that form the foundation for our behavioral strategies that we utilize for youth with ADHD. So in essence, be able to help you understand why would you do something instead of just say, do this, do that. Connect specific strategies or interventions with these big ideas or these big principles, if you will. And then we could talk about the specific strategies or what they would look like when we use them in an outpatient setting to give you some real life examples of what we try to do when we're providing treatment to children and families when we're trying to help them manage ADHD in their home environments. So what we're talking about is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Overall, ADHD is a complex neurodevelopmental disorder. We think about it as primarily a disorder of behavioral control or behavioral inhibition. So in essence, it has its primary impact on how well people are able to modulate or control their behavior in various situations. We don't think about it so much as a deficit in one's ability to pay attention, although the name kind of gives that idea. We do think about it more as a difficulty in being able to modulate or manage your attention or modulate or manage your behavior. So one of the ways we think about ADHD is it's not so much that your child or a child with ADHD has too much energy, for instance, although it may come across as that. It's more that they don't have a good enough control system for the energy or the behavior that they have. Many of you probably experienced that your child can pay attention to various things. So for any of us to try to tell a parent that your child has a deficit in attention sometimes comes across as hard to believe when they can play video games for hours on end, or they can watch TV or movies for a long time, or they can read books for a long time. Obviously, they can pay attention, sometimes quite well. What we find more is it's very hard to control their attention, and particularly to manage it and get it into something or turn it on when the task calls for it, particularly when it's a task that someone else or some other force or entity is trying to get you to do. So it's not self-directed, and it's not necessarily highly stimulating. Video games, reading for pleasure tend to be things that we either direct ourselves to do, or they tend to be really stimulating in their own right. So we don't have to put out a lot of effort to pay attention to them. Children with ADHD often tend to have deficits in being able to delay their gratification, that is, to respond to rewards that come further in the distance or further away in time. So that's why sometimes promising children big rewards that seem like they would be very meaningful, oftentimes don't appear to be all that effective for youth with ADHD. And they can be fairly slow or inconsistent in how well they complete things. So although they may have knowledge about something, they may know the answers, they tend to get distracted or tend to be fairly slow in how they work through things. So they may not finish things, they get off track, and they may not finish the things that they start oftentimes. Kids with ADHD tend to have a short and variable attention span. Behaviorally, we see them as hyperactive and impulsive, and really what I want you to come away with is to think about that as more they just can't modulate themselves, they can't control themselves, even though the rules are right out there, or they've been told what to do, or the nature of the environment should dictate to you what you should do. More boys than girls tend to have ADHD. Prevalence rates range anywhere from 2 to 1 to 6 to 1 as far as the boy to girl ratio. And estimates go anywhere from 5 to 10% of school-age children in the United States are diagnosed with ADHD. We have 3 subtypes or presentation types of ADHD. So I tend to think about it as the umbrella term is this thing we call attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And under the umbrella, we have 3 subtype presentations. One is the inattentive subtype, and basically what that means is that you have predominantly the attention problem symptoms of ADHD and not many of the hyperactive impulsive symptoms. There's the hyperactive impulsive subtype where you will have lots of the hyperactive impulsive symptoms, but not many of the attention problem symptoms. And there's what we call the combined presentation where you have both. You have many of the hyperactive impulsive symptoms and many of the inattention symptoms. In the diagnostic criteria, there are 9 attention problem symptoms and 9 hyperactive impulsive symptoms. And then there's a clinical cutoff of at least 6 of 9 in one category, the other, or both to meet part of the diagnostic criteria. In the middle column, it's just the estimated percent of the time that we see these different subtypes in clinic populations. So the most predominant is the combined subtype. About half the children that we see in clinic have this combined presentation. The second most common is the inattentive presentation, and we don't commonly see the hyperactive impulsive type. And when we do, it tends to be in younger children. Oftentimes children who are just starting out their formal schooling or prior to starting their formal schooling at fairly young ages. Kids with the inattentive type tend to have mostly school-based problems, school performance problems. Children with the hyperactive impulsive type tend to have behavioral difficulties predominantly, and they don't struggle too much in their academic performance necessarily. The combined subtype tends to have both. They struggle academically with school performance, and they will struggle behaviorally in different environments, home, school, and with their peer group, possibly. Okay. We're going to focus, as I said, the majority of our presentation will be focused on non-medical or behavioral interventions for youth with ADHD. But before we dive into that, we just want to make mention of the medical treatments that are available. The most important reason why we want to mention these is because they are highly effective for the majority of children who have ADHD. So there's about a 70 to 80% response rate for stimulant medication in particular for youth with ADHD. So to not mention it would be not telling you about one of the main treatments that we have in our toolbox, if you will, for youth with ADHD. The primary option are stimulant medications. You've probably heard of some stimulants, brand names like Concerta, Ritalin, Adderall, Vyvanse, Focalin, Metadate are all variations of stimulant medications. Stimulant medicines can be broken down into 2 subcategories: those that are based on methylphenidate, which as the primary agent, and those that are based on amphetamines or mixed amphetamine salts, like Vyvanse and Adderall. There doesn't seem to be evidence that says that one medicine is better than the others or is the best. They all tend to have, overall, if you look across populations, they tend to have fairly equivalent efficacy for children with ADHD. But any individual child may be more responsive to one medication compared to another, and different children may need different doses of medication. We tend to find that the combined subtype tends to have the greatest response rate. The inattentive subtype, that response rate can be a bit lower, although they tend to, their symptoms respond as well. The second option maybe for children who can't tolerate a stimulant very well for some potential medical reason, or they've tried stimulant medications, are compounds like atomoxetine, which has the brand name Strattera, or the alpha adrenergic agents or the alpha-2 agonists, guanfacine, clonidine, 10X, and Tuniv are brand names for those medications that you may have heard of as well. Okay. Again, this isn't a talk about medication per se, but we certainly want you to be aware of medication being a good option for many children with ADHD because it tends to be quite effective. So what we are going to focus on tonight is what we call behavioral therapy or behavior modification. You might also see this called psychosocial treatment. All those terms are relatively interchangeable, and basically what they mean is what they refer to are treatments that are based on principles of behavior modification or behavioral change. We know that behavioral therapy is also an effective treatment for ADHD. Reviews of behavioral treatment programs, things called behavioral parent training and behavioral classroom contingency management, which is basically behavioral parent training is a home-based application of behavior modification treatment, and behavioral classroom contingency management is more of a school classroom-based application of it, that they both meet the criteria for a well-established treatment. And basically what that means is that there have been multiple studies that have demonstrated that compared to a control group, the children or the subjects in the behavioral intervention program did better, reliably did better. And it wasn't just one study that showed that, there were multiple studies that were able to show that. The biggest effects tend to be for things like improving or changing parenting skills, rates of disruptive behavior, and rates of negative parent-child interactions. So we know that those tend to be our really good targets for behavioral interventions. What you won't necessarily see for behavioral interventions are the direct symptoms of ADHD. So note that this is talking about disruptive behavior as a broad term, negative interactions, child compliance with directions tends to be a really good target or a really effective target for behavioral interventions, but not necessarily all the symptoms of hyperactivity or inattention. One thing to keep, one kind of rule of thumb that we keep in mind is that behavioral interventions tend to do a great job with the downstream implications of symptoms of ADHD, not necessarily or not just the symptoms themselves. So they're very functional interventions, and we'll give you some ideas of how that works as we go through this evening's talk. Parents tend to rate psychosocial treatment or behavioral treatment as having a greater level of satisfaction with the intervention compared to medication. And I can tell you from personal experience and practicing for a number of years here that tends to be the case when I talk to parents as well. There's less wariness that parents tend to have for behavioral intervention or non-medicine interventions than they have for medication interventions. An updated study showed that for more research done more recently, that these two interventions continue to meet criteria for a well-established treatment. So at this point we have a lot of confidence that when you are able to do behavioral interventions well, which tends to be the key, you can get a really good effect. And hopefully we'll give you a good overview tonight of what that should look like. So if you pursue this sort of treatment, you'll know what you should be getting. So this is kind of our little diagram that shows us the ABCs of behavioral intervention. So we try to keep things really simple and straightforward as behavioral therapists. We're not too sophisticated necessarily. It's really straightforward, but it works. The ABCs are basically we think about things called antecedents, which are things that occur prior to a behavior. Target behavior, so what is it that we actually observe the youngster doing? And then the consequence, which is what happens after the behavior that has an influence on the probability of that behavior occurring again. That's what that red arrow is. This influences the probability of that. These are the basic principles of behavioral change. We also have an infusion, if you will, of social learning theory. That's what that box at the top means. Social learning theory means that people learn through their experiences that they have through interacting with the world, and we learn through observing the experiences of others. So we don't necessarily need to be hit on the head with a rock to understand that it hurts to be hit on the head with a rock. We can see that someone else was hit on the head with a rock. They went, ouch. They fell down. To know that, oh gosh, it looks like it hurts to get hit on the head with a rock. We don't necessarily have to have that same experience ourselves. And that's kind of an idea of what social learning theory tells us. So this is, we put this up here because we're going to keep referring back to this. And this is kind of a diagram of our big ideas. That we can intervene at the antecedent level. So we can change what happens prior to a behavior occurring. We can do things or put consequences into place after a behavior occurs. And by doing both, we can increase the probability that we get the target behavior, the behavior we actually want to see. And that's the name of the game, is that we want to increase the rates of behavior that we want and reduce rates of behavior that we don't like so much, or undesired behavior. So we just give this as a simple example that the parent tells the child to go to bed. The child continues to watch television instead of going to bed. And then the consequence is that the parent says louder, I told you to go to bed, raises their voice a little bit. And that ends up being their consequence. And that may or may not be an effective consequence. It may be somewhat of a real-life example for some of us in the room, or possibly for all of us. But it is a consequence of that behavior. And one of the things that we try to work with parents is that the things where you have some real control here is you can control a lot of what happens prior to the behavior ever being demonstrated. Not everything, but a lot. And you can control a lot about the consequences. What you can't control as directly as your child, their behavior. We can influence it, but unfortunately kids don't come with remote controls or little things on their backs where we can just kind of rewire things. They don't come with Xbox controllers where you can just hit button A and they'll go to bed, unfortunately. Or fortunately, I guess depends on your ethics, I suppose. So we can only influence. And this is all about influence and the probabilities of behavior occurring. So the first thing we'll talk about are antecedents. So what are antecedents? Well, antecedents are basically things that are features of the environment or the individual that have an influence on their behavior. More than one antecedent can be in play or be part of the picture or have an influence over behavior at any given point in time. Antecedents can only impact the probability of behavior occurring. So as I said, we can't force things to happen. We can only influence the probabilities of certain things happening. For example, everybody in this room is sitting in a chair. I don't think at any point I directly told anybody, sit down. But yet everybody's sitting down, and there's probably some good reasons for that. Why are you people sitting down? Right, you're in a room, in a talk. It kind of makes sense to sit down. If you come into a room where everybody's sitting down, what do you tend to do? Sit down. Any other reasons why you're sitting down?
Chairs were provided.
There are chairs. What if we didn't have chairs? What would you do? Right? The chances of you sitting down would decrease dramatically. Now, maybe someone would choose to sit on the floor. That would be OK. But the probability of a different behavior occurring there would be a different probability. OK? And that's just a simple example of all the different ways that we have to sometimes think about the environment or the individual. Maybe you're sitting down because you were on your feet all day and walking around and standing, and oh gosh, it just feels great to sit down finally. So we can improve our odds, but we can't guarantee behavior. I tell parents the way I think about antecedents or changing antecedents is cheating, in essence. If you're someone who gambles, if you ever play blackjack or things like that, people who count cards, not that you're supposed to do such things, of course, but it's a way of improving your odds. You can't make the good outcome happen, but boy, you can change the probability of the good outcome happening. And that's what influencing the antecedents is all about. So it's cheating in the way that you're allowed to cheat. So some things are features of the environment, like having chairs here. Sometimes things are features of the individual. If you've ever lost your cool in a situation where you normally don't lose your cool, and you think back on it later, or you apologize to the person you might have yelled at, maybe you would say something along the lines of, "I'm sorry, it was a really bad day at work," or "I'm sorry, I didn't sleep last night, and I'm really tired," or "I don't feel well, my allergies are acting up," whatever. Those are antecedent influences within you that can influence one's behavior. And what we try to do is come up with as many direct influences on behavior as we can to try to increase the probability that we get the behavior that we want. And that's the name of the game in dealing with antecedents. So some examples of antecedent interventions, and we'll just break these down by different age group ranges. So at a preschool level, giving a specific direction one at a time. So not grouping, not stringing together 3 directions for a 5-year-old or a 4-year-old, given that their ability to hold that much information in memory may not be as great as if you're 9, 10, 11, or 12. Showing a child that's that young exactly what you want them to do. So if you want them to clean up some toys, demonstrating, picking up the Legos, putting them in the Lego box, picking up the stuffed animals, putting them in the stuffed animal box. That can, again, it may not guarantee that the child will do what you want them to do, but it certainly should increase the chances of it happening compared to saying, hey, clean up the Legos. At the school age level, since school age kids have to deal with homework, and it's one of everybody's favorite part of the day typically, trying to do homework when the child's not exhausted. So for some kids, that's as soon as they get home from school, they're just wiped and they need some time to recover. For other kids, it's once you hit like 7 o'clock, they're done. They're tapped out. They're not going to get any work done. So knowing your child and knowing when the best time potentially to do homework is going to be. Removing distractions from the environment when you're going to do homework. So some of the old adages that we kind of know already, don't do homework in front of the television. I mean, that's a way of just thinking about antecedents. If you're in front of something that's way more interesting than what you're about to do, the chances of you staying focused on the boring thing are really low. So we try to remove some of the things that could distract us from what we really need to do. At the teen level, having ground rules for when you can go out, what do you need to accomplish before you go out, when can you come home. I have a daughter at home. One of her ground rules is before she can go out with her friends on the weekend, all of her clothes and trash has to be off her bedroom floor. That doesn't mean it always happens, but it increases the chances, since she knows that that's the case, that that's going to happen, hopefully. Okay. So one common antecedent-based intervention that we use across all of our age groups is something called effective instructions. You may also, if you read any parenting books, this may also be referred to as effective commands or effective directions. And basically, it's just some simple guidelines. Many of them are kind of common sense level things to increase the probability that when you give a direction to your child, he or she, you increase the chance that they'll do what you're telling them to do. And it sounds really simple, but you'd be surprised, and if you really listen to yourself, how we tell children what we want them to do. So some of the directions, some of the strategies are, just keep the directions short, simple, concise, as few words as possible to deliver your message. In essence, if you give a lot of words before or after your direction, Billy, you need to get your shoes on. We're going to Grandma's house. And remember, we don't like to be late for Grandma's house. You know how she hates to be late, because then we have to put off dinner, and it gets cold and she gets really irritated. All right, so get your shoes on. Billy at some point might have thought, oh, Grandma's for dinner. That means we get brownies. That's great. And I have no idea what my mom or dad just said about my shoes, because all I thought about was going to Grandma's for dinner. So stay focused on your message. Using a neutral tone of voice. So one of the things we try to help parents understand is if we can give a really effective instruction, we hopefully will reduce the probability that you have to yell later on. And many of us as parents, we almost get trained that in order to get our child to follow our direction, we have to raise our voice. And if you sit back and think about it, when does your child really know to listen to you? When you raise your voice, when you yell, when you really, quote unquote, mean it. And what effective instructions is all about is to retrain yourself and your child that the first time is when I mean it. But if we want that to happen, the first time has to be the best time. The best instruction is the first instruction. That's the way we want it to come out. But that requires a lot of work oftentimes, because we, as parents, as adults, we just get into bad habits. Make instructions direct. So it's not time for the nicey mommy voice or the nice daddy voice. Honey, before we go, do you think you could put your shoes in the shoe basket now? It's not the time for that. All right? Because children who don't like to follow directions or get distracted easily may very well say, in a minute, no, not right now. You gave me the option, no. It really depends on the child. We can't speak to kids like we speak to adults. Like if my wife says, Steve, on the way home, do you think you could pick up some milk? That means to me, on the way home, stop, pick up milk, come home. It's not, not necessarily an option. Not, my wife's, great, but I can interpret what that means. She doesn't have to directly tell me that. State instructions positively. So what we want to think about is what is the behavior we actually want you to demonstrate, not what do we want you to stop doing. Make sure you have your child's attention. This is huge for our population. How many times have you called a direction or an instruction across a room into the next room? How many times have you told your child to do something while they're watching SpongeBob or their favorite television show, or while their eyes are glued to an iPad? Okay? If you're doing that, you are not getting your child's direction, and the probability of what you want to see happen, of actually happening, is extremely low. So that's where giving an instruction really effectively can increase the probability of getting that right behavior. Not guarantee, but increase it. And then using when-then statements, basically, when you put your shoes away, then we can go watch TV or whatever that might be. So that's antecedents. And again, antecedents are all the things that we do prior to a behavior to help influence the behavior occurring that we want. The next piece of our behavioral change strategy is actually thinking about behavior. And we don't necessarily do that all the time, but it's important that we think about what is the behavior that we actually want. So we think about things as target behaviors, and sometimes when we think about target behaviors, what we interpret is the behavior that we don't want to see anymore. I'm targeting the behavior that I don't want anymore. And when we work with families, we try to change that thinking around. The target behavior is, what is it that I want to see more of? What's the behavior I want to see more frequently? And the term we often use is desired behavior for our target behavior. Target behaviors must be well defined to be effective targets for intervention. So we can't use things like be good. Oftentimes when I ask a child who's getting some kind of reward system with their parent, and I ask them, well, what do you have to do, Billy, to get that reward? Oh, I have to be good. Great. What does that mean? I have to be good. And that's my clue that, Billy may not have the same idea as be good as his mom or dad do. So we have to be really specific with what our target behavior is going to be. Follow directions the first time. Start your homework on time. Put your shoes in the basket. Hang your clothes up. These are examples of specific target behaviors that are do behaviors, the things that we actually want to see happen. There are things that we can see. We can observe. We can hear. I could tell you what that behavior is, and you would know exactly what I'm talking about. Be good means something different for me as it does for some other parent, I'm sure. It's measurable. So not necessarily that we have to have people running around with pieces of paper measuring how frequently certain things happen. But if you had to, since you can observe it, you actually could. That's a good target behavior. And it's developmentally appropriate. So we don't ask 5-year-olds to mow the lawn as the target behavior, for instance, because it's not developmentally appropriate for them to do so. We have to make sure that whatever the behavior is, it's something that's actually feasible for that youngster to do. The term that we often, or the guiding strategy or the guiding principle for desired behaviors that we often want to think about the positive opposite. So basically, what's the behavior you don't like so much? And what's the opposite behavior? What is an opposite behavior we can think of that would be a more desired behavior? So stop. If a teacher or a parent, identifies a behavior like don't interrupt, or stop interrupting me, we want to come up with a positive opposite, using excuse me, waiting your turn before speaking. If you're in a classroom, raising your hand before speaking. Those will all be more desirable opposite behaviors that we can reinforce, measure, see when it's happening, and give feedback about. And that's a key for behavioral change. We have to know what we're trying to target and what we're trying to change. And we have to be able to give feedback. So now we know about what do we want to do before our target behavior happens. We know about target behaviors now. Now we're going to talk about consequences. Consequences are simply things that occur after a behavior, events, influences that occur after a behavior that affect or impact the probability of that behavior occurring in the future. And remember back to what we said a little bit earlier, that the basic goal here is that we have a target behavior that we want to see increase in its probability, and we can influence that before the behavior ever occurs through our antecedents, and we can influence that with our consequences after the behavior's occurred. A little note here, consequences are used best at the point of performance. Basically what that means is that the guiding principle is the more that we can put a consequence in place right when the behavior occurs that we want to have occur, the greater the degree of influence that the behavior is going to have, that consequence is going to have on someone's behavior. If the consequence comes later in time, an hour later, a day later, next week, the further away the consequence is from the target behavior occurring, the less influence it tends to have. Okay, it's a direct association, if you will. So the primary consequence that we use in behavioral change for youth with ADHD and other disruptive behavior disorders is something called positive reinforcement. The big idea of positive reinforcement is that it increases the frequency of behavior associated with that consequence. So it increases the probability of that behavior occurring again in the future. It's the key strategy for behavioral change. So it is the big tool in our toolbox, if you will, when we want to make behavior change occur. In essence, what positive reinforcement is it's something that you are putting into the situation, you're adding to the situation, that's the positive part, that reinforces the behavior, that is, increases the frequency of it occurring again. That's what the reinforcement part of positive reinforcement means. Positive reinforcement doesn't necessarily mean that it is something that the person views as positive, and that's often something that people get confused by. But it does mean that it's usually something desired that occurs as a consequence that should have the impact of increasing the probability of that behavior occurring again. Some types of positive reinforcement are reinforcers that have their value without us having to be socialized to them. So primary need reinforcers like food, water, things like that are things that we don't have to be trained to understand are positive reinforcers. Other things actually gain their value through experience. So money, for instance, gains its value through our experience and knowledge that I can take a dollar bill to a store and trade it for something else that I want. But a one-year-old would see a dollar bill and just start feeling it and not have any understanding that it has actual value beyond what it feels like. We just understand it because we've been socialized to understand it. Some of the secondary side effects of positive reinforcement is it often improves relationships between the person delivering the reinforcement and the person receiving it, and can help support children's self-esteem because they get a lot of positive feedback, in essence, through using positive reinforcement strategies. So the basic idea here on this slide is that the blue bars represent that the behavior that we, the more desired behavior, the behavior that we'd like to see more of. The red bar is usually where we start from, that we're having just much more frequent undesired behavior. And through the application of positive reinforcement, we're trying to increase the growth of frequency of desired behavior. And naturally what occurs is that undesired behavior decreases in its frequency because, in essence, these two bars together equal 100% of behavior. And if you increase the frequency of one type of behavior, the other naturally has to go down. You can't go above 100%, if you will. Okay? So that's kind of how we conceptualize how positive reinforcement works. Some examples of types of positive reinforcement or strategies of positive reinforcement. At a preschool level, we often use something called verbal praise, and I'll talk about that more in a little bit. But in essence, every time a child follows a direction or demonstrates the behavior that we want them, they get praise. A parent, a caregiver, a teacher telling them that what they did is exactly what we want them to do. At a school age level, we use something called a token economy, which I'll talk a little bit more about as well. And that's basically a way of providing small rewards on a highly frequent basis in response to demonstrating desired behavior. And at teen level, we often bypass the token economy. We just directly associate privileges to the demonstration of desired behavior. So, the privilege of being able to go out with your friends later, or using your cell phone, or using the computer at home is contingent on me seeing that your homework's been finished. And you don't get access to the one until you show me the other, in essence. I mentioned on the prior slide that verbal praise is one of our key strategies of positive reinforcement. Verbal praise is a form of parental attention. Parental attention is actually something that we overlook a lot of time as a key reinforcement strategy. But we can get a lot of mileage out of it. Attention for children and for people, quite frankly, is highly reinforcing. We all thrive on attention. It is in an unlimited supply, and it's within you. You can give as much as you're able, and you never run out of attention. And it's relatively easy to use once you understand how it's supposed to function and how one can utilize it. So in essence, by increasing the rates of contingent attention on even okay behavior, things that aren't necessarily rule-governed or rule-following, but just demonstrating a desired behavior, a mildly desired behavior in a given situation, is a way to increase the rate of that behavior. And one of the things we focus on is helping parents increase the rate of attention they give their child in response to behavior that's just at a very okay level. It's not necessarily the target behavior or the end state behavior, but it's in essence the absence of an undesired behavior. You're not being bad, you get my attention. By increasing the rate, what we talk about is that we give parents challenges to catch your child being good 10 times a day, 20 times a day, and saying things like, oh, I see you're sitting down. So if they're at the table and they're simply sitting there, you're sitting at the table. Not necessarily praising, oh, what a great job you're doing sitting at the table. Oh, you're sitting at the table. We're having a nice meal together. You're cleaning up your clothes. Just noticing the good stuff as it happens. All the things that fly under the radar oftentimes, we want to put at the forefront of our attention and our child's attention. Okay? Relatively simple to understand, but often hard to execute. But it's a key strategy. The other thing I said I would come back to is something called a token economy. These are things that people have often heard of. You may often hear referred to as a token system. Token economies are basically using some sort of tangible object like a poker chip, a marble, whatever you want to use. It doesn't really matter. To represent small increments of reinforcement. It makes the reinforcement more real, if you will, for the individual child. So every time the child demonstrates the desired behavior, you tell them that they did what you wanted them to do. Great job cleaning up your toys, Jimmy. Here's a poker chip. And the poker chips represent something. They may represent, if you get 10 poker chips, by this time, you get to trade them in for video game time. Or you get to trade them in for something from a grab bag of prizes. Or you get to trade them in for a special dessert that otherwise you wouldn't get access to. It doesn't, all those things are very individual, but that's the basic concept behind the token economy. The real point of a token economy is to basically give the parent a vehicle to apply reinforcement at the point of performance and doing so consistently. So what I kind of tell the parents that I'm working with is you're going to have us apply these tokens, and your job is to get rid of as many as you can during the day. You don't want the tokens anymore. And if you're getting rid of them, that means you are kind of forcing yourself, if you will, to notice your child's good behavior and to reward their good behavior on a more consistent level than you used to. And that's how we build more good behavior in occurring. All right? We have 4 principles of positive reinforcement, and token economies really help us with that. Frequency refers to giving positive reinforcement on a frequent basis, so the more consistently you do so, the more frequently you do so, the more influence you'll have over a youngster's behavior, the more power it will have. Immediacy is that point of performance principle. The closer in time the provision of the positive reinforcement is to the desired behavior, the more of a connection is made. Saliency means that the positive reinforcer is meaningful to the child. So it has some desirability to the individual child. So if you were giving stickers of Barbie figures to a little boy who isn't that really interested in Barbie, they really like Iron Man, you saying, great job, Billy, I love the way you did that. Here's a Barbie sticker, may not really be a lot reinforcing to them because it's not a desired thing for them. It doesn't have saliency. And that we make our reinforcement specific. So you're getting this token or you're getting this praise because you did X. From a praise standpoint, the principle we work on is something called labeled verbal praise. And the labeled part is that I'm telling you exactly what you did to get my praise. It's not just telling you good job. Overall, we have a 4-to-1 rule, and Dr. Proctor in a second is going to tell you give you some information about punishment. But basically, our 4-to-1 ratio rule is that we want 4 times as much reinforcement available for the individual child as we do for any punishment. So that really means that any time you provide a punitive consequence to the child, you have to have given them 4 opportunities or 4 positive reinforcers, whether it's tokens, praise, attention, what have you, in order to kind of buy yourself one punishment. That's the way that ratio has to work. And it's a guiding principle. You don't have to keep count necessarily. To follow the principle of frequency, especially for behaviors that take a little bit of time to accomplish, like cleaning up toys, you can provide reinforcement throughout that whole time. So you may, when you tell the child, Billy, clean up your toys now, put them in the bucket. As soon as he gets started, you at that point, you'll say, oh, great, I love that you got started right away. And as he's cleaning up toys, you may just give attention. Oh, that's a lot of Legos in the bucket. Oh, you got some more in the bucket. Hey, you've got a lot of those Legos put away. You're almost done, which is just attention. And at the end, you'll give another another praise statement. You did a great job cleaning up those Legos, Billy. Way to go. Here's a token. Okay? So with that, I'm going to hand things off to Dr. Proctor, who's going to talk to you about punishment and some other topics.
Thank you, Dr. Soffer. So along with punishment, I'm going to describe what punishment is, talk about some of the risks of it, and then give some examples of what that looks like in various contexts. So the punishment operates in the opposite way that reinforcement did. So whereas reinforcement resulted in an increase in the frequency of a behavior response, punishments do the opposite in that they decrease the frequency or the probability. And like we said, we're always going to be focusing on probabilities. We're hoping that dependent on how well that punishment is used, that it's going to decrease certain types of behaviors. Now there's a couple different methods in which punishment can be applied. One is presenting an aversive event, and the other is removing a positive event. An aversive event may be something like giving them a chore or asking them to do something extra of something that they didn't really enjoy doing. Removing a positive event would be removing some form of reinforcement, something that they enjoy, electronics or things like that, or hanging out with friends. Now, here's some important things to remember is just like we were saying with that 4-to-1 ratio, we want to use it infrequently. We want to spend a lot more of our energy on more of the positive reinforcement end of things. Punishment needs to be used, of course, but we don't want to use it. We don't want to flip the proportion and focus more on punishment. Oftentimes when parents first start to see us, they have been spending a lot more of their time focusing on punishment-based interventions and a little less of that on the positive end of things, which, as you can imagine, has an effect on the parent-child relationship, and it doesn't improve the behavior, which is why they're seeking some extra help with that. Punishment needs to be used consistently, and just like with positive reinforcement, when you observe that behavior that you identified as one that you're going to use a punishment intervention for, it needs to be used consistently every time. Not just some of the time, because then a child may learn that, well, if I do it again, there's a probability that mom or dad won't take away my electronics for that. It also needs to be a planned response. Oftentimes punishments, and like I'll describe in another slide, are kind of knee-jerk reactions to things. And where that leads to some problems is that a parent may over-punish. So you can't play with your electronics for a month. Or they may choose a punishment that's not very effective or meaningful for the kid. Again, like I was saying earlier, is that punishment, it tends to be often overused by not only just parents, but it also is overused by teachers as well. Like we showed you with the graph again, so positive reinforcement was really working on increasing a lot more of the behaviors that we wanted to see, whereas punishment is working on that opposite end of reducing the behaviors that we're not interested in seeing. So you want to work on both ends, but like we had stressed before, a lot more focus on that positive reinforcement to increase the behaviors that we're interested in seeing, or those target behaviors, as Dr. Soffer mentioned. Now, we do want to spend some time talking about some of the risk of punishment because there are several. The first one is oftentimes when punishments are applied, there's usually a lot of emotion in that. You're usually very upset, you're frustrated, and there's a lot of things that go into that. The child isn't complying with something that you're asking them to do. Maybe there's time constraints or other things going on, and so you may be a lot more upset when you apply that consequence, and it may lead to kind of a poor management of that punishment or a poor use of it. Oftentimes, too, if someone or at the home is doing on punishment interventions, children may then learn to avoid whoever's the person giving the punishment, and kind of shift more of their behavior or attention towards the person who is, being less punitive. What this highlights then is, for any of these interventions, whether it be positive reinforcement or punishment-based interventions, is consistency between the caregivers, whether it's in a home or across homes in different settings. Also, depending on the type of punishment that a person may be using, it actually may lead to aggression towards the person giving it, towards the parent. Depending on how punitive that response, it actually may escalate a lot of the behaviors for certain kids. Also, punishment tends to provide a poor model for how to how to deal with aversive behavior, or how to deal with when someone's not getting along with you. So you may find that, well, I use yelling as a punishment when my child doesn't listen to me. So then likewise, a child may decide that if their brother isn't listening to them, well, they're going to yell at or hit them or take something away from them as well. So you want to make sure that when you're thinking about what punishment intervention you use, that is it providing a good model for how they should handle situations or times when things aren't going well for them as well. Like we had mentioned earlier, use of punishment techniques tends to get reinforced pretty quickly, especially when you use punishments that aren't really effective. So like Dr. Soffer was saying earlier, if you find that you have to yell to get your child to follow your directions, as soon as they follow those directions, you get reinforced by that, so it increases the likelihood that you'll yell again. So that's one of the kind of the downsides of that, is because even though it may seem effective in the long term, you just end up using that ineffective response. Now here's an example of some different punishment interventions based on just different ages. So for a preschooler, you may put a child in a timeout chair for not following an instruction. For a school-age child, going along with Dr. Soffer was showing with the token economy, they may lose points or tokens from that system in response to hitting their sibling. For an adolescent, this may be something where instead of taking things away like you did for these are what we call response costs. This is where you present something aversive, like washing a couple extra cars after using the cars for permission. So again, there's two different methods that you can have for punishment. It can be presenting something aversive or taking something that's meaningful away. So as I described earlier with the timeout, timeout is a strategy that many of you have heard, and really the thing that we stress here is that it's timeout from positive reinforcement. So a lot of times when people are thinking about timeout, they're thinking, well, I'm going to send her to timeout so she can just sit there and think about it. And that's not really the point of timeout, and that's not why it tends to be an effective strategy. When they are in their timeout, if it's done effectively, they should be getting no attention from you, siblings, other people at all. There should be just kind of like a black box of attention from that. And then ending that is based on the child being calm. So it can't just be when they say, okay, I'm done, or I'm going to do that now. Because if they're still really upset, let's say that you put them in timeout for hitting a sibling and they were very upset by it. So you send them to timeout. You need to wait till they're calm. The reason why we suggest waiting until they're calm is because they're showing you that they're ready to come out of timeout and they're ready to comply with whatever it was that was the reason they were put in timeout. So if you put them in timeout for refusing to clean up their room, by them calming down during timeout and showing you that they're showing you that they're ready to comply. And one of the things that needs to be done afterwards is they need to complete the original task. If you say you're going to timeout for not cleaning a room, and when they're calm and you let them out of timeout, and you don't enforce that effective command of you clean your room now, they've learned to escape. They just learn that, well, if I don't clean my room, all I'm going to have to do is go to timeout for 3 minutes. No big deal, because someone else is going to clean my room, or they're just going to forget all about it. So when you're thinking about what was the reason that you told them they're going to timeout, make sure that that task that they didn't do, if it was for non-compliance, is something that they follow up with. Now, timeout is very effective when done correctly, but it can be difficult to do. Some parents struggle with how long, when to do it, what age, what to do when your child doesn't want to go in timeout, what to do when they don't stay in timeout. So, like we said, we're just giving you an overview of these behavioral strategies, but we don't expect that just from this slide here that you're going to be able to go home and do all timeouts effectively. Now, the other end is response costs, and that's what we had discussed with on the previous slide, is removing things like tokens or reinforcement in response to an undesired behavior. Now, that, not only can you remove tokens, but you can also remove privileges. And privileges come in many forms, and it depends on what's meaningful for your kid. So that can be access to, extracurriculars. It can be things like things that they have around the house, playing with friends, having a sleepover. A lot of those are privileges. So they can have a response cost or a removal of those based on their behavior. Now, moving from punishment, we want to talk about what we call extinction-based interventions. And the big difference from the punishment ones is discontinuation of reinforcement. And this is discontinuation of any kind of reinforcement, whether it be positive in the form of praise or attention, or punishment in the form of yelling, screaming, giving a lot of commands over and over again. And again, just like we were discussing before, the point of this is to decrease the probability of that behavior again. One of the primary techniques for this is what we call ignoring or active ignoring. So you're intentionally doing this on purpose. You're deliberately withdrawing attention and you're waiting for the good behavior. This is really effective strategy for things like whining, begging, and behaviors like that. Primarily a lot of the verbal behaviors that it's okay to ignore. Now, of course, we don't want to ignore behaviors that are problematic, like hitting, destruction of property, or kind of running off, because those could lead to other forms of consequence. And you want to sort of think about what punishments you want to have for those behaviors. But for ignoring, this is a strategy that's really can be used really effectively. But on the other hand, it needs to be used in what we call a reinforcement-rich environment. If you ignore your kid all the time, ignoring them for a negative behavior isn't really going to change anything much because they're already used to being ignored. So like we were saying with our 4-to-1 ratio, if there's a lot of positive reinforcement in the form of attention, praise, then ignoring, taking that away, the child starts to realize, wait, I want that other stuff that you were just doing. Okay, I'll clean my room now because I want that reinforcement that you were giving me before. Likewise, with just being in a pattern where you're always ignoring, if parents get into a pattern where they tend to ignore too frequently, they may end up ignoring behaviors that they want to reinforce. So if you notice that your child starts to pick up, clean up the table after dinner and you don't say anything because you're just like, oh, either you didn't notice it or you just like, I don't want to disturb them while they're doing something that I want, you may decrease the likelihood of them doing that behavior because you didn't give any reinforcement for that. Now we're going to talk a little bit about just some times when, a lot of the questions tend to come from parents about different things like such as, what if the reinforcement doesn't seem to work? And here's just a couple of points to consider, because just because you've thought you've come up with a really good reinforcement plan, if it's not working, you got to problem solve a little bit. You want to think about things like, is it immediate? Well, did I say, if he cleaned his room that next week he'll get to go do this fun thing? For kids with ADHD, that tends to be really hard. We talked earlier about they have this difficulty with delaying gratification. So as much as possible, we want the rewards to be as immediate to the situation as we can. Now, there are ways to kind of bridge that gap with something like a token economy where the immediate reinforcement are those chips that you're using, which lead up to that bigger reward that might happen later on. But that immediate reinforcement they were getting was from that daily token about how well they were doing that behavior. Is it available in all affected settings? Does that, are others doing this as well? And this is where I said it needs to be consistent between people. So if your child is going between homes or there's another caregiver, are other people reinforcing those behaviors as well? And sometimes it requires a little bit of coaching and encouragement for other people to say, hey, we're working on this behavior. We really want him to keep his hands and feet to himself. So when you notice that he's doing that, let him know he's doing a great job keeping his hands and feet to himself. You also want to make sure, as Dr. Soffer was saying, is it meaningful to the child? Oftentimes what we think is a great reward or a great reinforcer for a child may not be. An easy shortcut that I usually use for this is, what does the child usually spend a lot of their free time doing? What do they gravitate towards? When they're not doing their homework or they have some downtime, what are they going to play with, or what do they want to do for fun? Usually those are very reinforcing for them, and so then you can start to think about, oh, well, he actually spends a lot more time outside than I realized. Well, maybe that can be the reinforcer for completing his homework on time. You want to also think about whether there are any other forms of reinforcement that are unwittingly maintaining the undesired behavior. So even though you may be doing a good job of ignoring a certain behavior, is there someone else who's not doing a good job of ignoring that behavior? Are you, even though you're reinforcing something, is there someone who's not reinforcing the behavior? So again, that highlights a lot of the consistency across people and across settings. Lastly, is the reinforcement plan too complicated? sometimes parents get pretty ambitious and they want to create, really detailed Excel spreadsheets for, all these 5 behaviors, and then, these, well, if the kid gets this level of things, then they get this. And it can be hard to do because like we said, a lot of these strategies need to be immediate. They need to be done consistently. And if you've created something you can't follow up on pretty well, then it's going to fall apart. Because you can't always just run to your Excel sheet and compare your notes and figure out how many tokens a child has had for a certain behavior. So, and those can be done well, but usually when you're starting out, start pretty small and basic with this, and then you can work your way up to more involved systems. We talked about this earlier, so I'll just kind of highlight it again. This is what we call the punishment trap. So when you do a behavior like yelling, to get a child to stop doing a behavior, when the child stops and follows what you're saying, you get reinforced for doing that behavior again. It's what we call negative reinforcement. So when the termination of the aversive state is the child's behavior. So if the child is engaging in a negative behavior or not complying, so you decide, well, if I raise my voice or give a really harsh punishment, then the kid finally complies with you or finally starts to become more quiet, you get reinforced with that. You're like, okay, well, I'm just going to have to do that every time. And so parents then start to get into a punishment trap where instead of thinking about what other strategies they may have learned, they just go to the one that worked best, the one that worked last time, even though it takes a lot of the risk of the punishments that we highlighted earlier. With the extinction, ignoring works really, really well, but it can become very challenging for parents, because even slight kind of ways that you're giving attention, so even nonverbal, like looking at a child when you're trying to do an ignoring intervention, may still give some attention, because the child may know that they're kind of getting to you. So if you're trying to ignore a silly behavior that you don't think should be reinforced with any attention, if you're kind of like huffing and puffing, well, they know they're still getting attention from it. It's still affecting you, so that silly behavior is just going to be maintained. If they're not getting any attention that's reinforcing that behavior, then there's really no point for them to continue engaging in that silly or off-task behavior. Like we said, but you don't want to just focus solely on ignoring without having a very high reinforcement type of setting, and also then focusing on the alternative behavior. So as soon as the child stops engaging in the behavior that you're ignoring, you turn around and say, hey, I love the way that you're sitting calmly right now. So you don't want to just ignore it when, you want to ignore it during the time when they're engaging in the undesired behavior, but as soon as you see the behavior that you want to see, that's when you turn the switch on and give the attention for that behavior so that you can reinforce that behavior again. So in conclusion, as we discussed, behavioral treatment can be a helpful adjunct to medication for the treatment of ADHD-related behaviors. The influence of ADHD should be considered when constructing a behavioral treatment plan. So you want to think about a lot of the areas where they struggle, things like their attention span, delays of gratification, difficulties inhibiting behavior. You want to take that into consideration when you're thinking about which of these interventions you're going to use and how you're going to do that. With the behavioral interventions, you need to clearly define the target behaviors that you want to see. So again, it can't be something vague like just, I want them to be good overall. What does that mean? Break it down. And you may need to start with just choosing a few target behaviors that you want to see more of, get a lot of success and traction with reinforcing those, and then switch to some other behaviors that you've defined as your target behaviors. Again, you want to focus on modifying antecedents and consequences, and as much as you can, because you know your child best, is what tends to happen just before my child engages in this behavior, and what can I do to plan for decreasing the likelihood of that? Because if you're always playing catch up with consequences, it's going to be a lot more work. If we can decrease the odds of it happening in the first place, we'll have to do less work on the consequence end of trying to repair that work as well. So a preventative model is really good with working with children with ADHD. Again, behavioral treatment is most effective when it's applied at the point of performance, so as immediate as possible. Now, that may not always be possible, but that should really be the goal, is as close to when the behavior is occurring for reinforcing a behavior, punishing, or ignoring a behavior.
Because as soon as you say, oh, you're whining, you're now giving attention to the behavior, contingent on the behavior that you don't want to see. Right. So even though the content of your statement is, you're doing something I don't really like so much, the fact that you've made a statement right there is you've basically poured attention into the situation. And ignoring or extinction is to suck all the attention out of the situation, if you will. As Dr. Proctor said, ignoring is, I think it's the most challenging behavioral or parenting strategy we ask parents to do. I typically tell parents that it's my upper level coursework, if you will, it's like the 400 level course to do ignoring, because it's really challenging. Children are not accustomed to being ignored, and they will break you. They will do everything they can to break you, in essence. And you have to really believe in what you're doing, understand why you're doing it, and in essence hold out. And know and believe that that's the right thing to do. Ignoring really only works if you have a reinforcement-rich environment. So there's lots of opportunities for attention and praise for desired behavior, and the ignoring becomes the polar opposite of that. So as soon as you switch to a behavior that's undesirable, I ignore you. Other ways that we can influence the possibility of ignoring being effective is I sometimes, in appointments or in sessions, will role play ignoring with a parent and their child. So we'll talk about specific target behavior. And beyond just telling them, hey, if you whine, mommy's going to ignore you, that means she's not going to talk to you. We'll actually role play what that looks like, what that feels like. Maybe I'll be the child, the parent will be the parent, or then we'll actually do it with the child. Some way that they can actually see it, experience it. Going back to that social learning piece of things, children can learn all sorts of behavior just by seeing how it happens. And if they can experience in a role play situation, it may help with that generalization to the real world. When mom starts to or dad starts to ignore that behavior, then something will click and they'll say, oh yeah, that's right, I'm whining. The other thing that sometimes parents can do to help the child understand that they're ignoring them right now is to talk about the ignored behavior without actually talking to the child. So if there's two adults in the situation and the child is over and over saying, but mommy, I don't want to go to bed, please, no. And they're ignoring that complaining behavior to make it go away. The one parent can say to the other something like, Billy is complaining a lot. When he stops complaining, we can pay attention to him, which is not talking to Billy. It's talking to your parent partner or the other adult in the room. So it doesn't really qualify as giving attention. But there's a little clue in there that hopefully the child will pick up on that will help them kind of click into, oh, yeah, that's right. If I want my parents to pay attention to me, I have to demonstrate a behavior that they actually like instead of this stuff. Okay? But tough stuff. Mm-hmm. Very tough stuff.
Okay. Generally depends on what's going to happen between the time when they get home and dinner. Oftentimes when you're thinking about, with positive reinforcement, we're using different things that are meaningful and motivating to children to get them to do the things that they may not want to do. So if finishing homework is a difficulty for your child, if they're engaging in something before, something positive or meaningful before the homework, you've then lost a lot of that motivation for them to then do the homework. So generally, usually my just default suggestion is, give them a brief break, when they get home, and then begin homework then. And then the other activities that they want to engage in, like playtime or kind of the free time, would come afterwards as a reinforcement for them completing their homework. Does that make sense? Now it's harder to do if they've got other activities. Some kids play sports, so they come home, play sport, go to dinner, and then do your homework afterwards. But then you would still try to just come up with some way that when they complete their homework on time, or do it the way that, depending on what your problem is, that there's reinforcement following that. So depending on your kind of schedule, you may have to be flexible with that, but always just thinking, if I give them this choice about doing it before or afterwards, do I have any, how am I going to reinforce that behavior? Am I going to give them that sort of treat, so to speak, too soon? And then when I say, okay, you've played video games for an hour, now time to do homework. What do you think is going to happen? No, it's less likely to happen. You even might kind of get into an argument, or kind of, they may be less likely to do it. Yeah.
Don't give them the carrot until they demonstrated the behavior.
Right.
Definitely some logic there. But unfortunately, sometimes you've, kind of like what Dr. Proctor just said, you may have gotten yourself into such a hole, or they got themselves in such a hole, that that's not going to be enough to dig you out. There is a concept that we use that's an antecedent intervention called a forced choice. A forced choice is basically giving the child an illusion of having a choice, when really, no matter what they choose is equally desirable to the parent. So if you want your child to wear a short sleeve shirt to school, you can give them a forced choice of they can wear that short sleeve shirt, or that short sleeve shirt. Any of them are fine with me, but I'm giving you the choice of which short sleeve shirt you're going to wear. But in essence, I am kind of putting a directive on you that you're going to wear a short sleeve shirt to school today. But there's a choice there. For homework, back to your example, you can give a choice of you can do your homework right after school or at this point in time. Either way you're going to do your homework. That can work. That is a forced choice in some ways. However, I do agree with what Dr. Proctor was saying, that if they are engaging in a reinforcing activity before they do their homework, you've lost some of your leverage, if you will. And I hate to think about leverage, but in essence, that's what it is. You want to be able to say, when you finish your homework, then you get to do this more desirable activity. If you got to do the more desirable activity beforehand, the leverage I have to get you to do your homework, something that you find highly undesirable and highly unpleasant, isn't so great. And we need that.
Because I see, because there's another piece to your point, which is like you want to be able to explain to them, like, you made this choice and this is what the consequence was. So you could say, if you don't do your homework, then you don't get to play your video game. And then when that night before they go to bed, and they're like, well, I didn't get to have any game time. Then you can have the discussion. Well, like I said earlier, when you do your homework, then you can play your video game time. You didn't do your homework tonight, so that's why you didn't get it. But tomorrow, I'm hoping things go a lot differently. And that's, again, when I was talking about punishment, is you want to make sure you're not over-punishing so that you can give an opportunity for the child to show you the behavior that you were hoping for, that target behavior. But if you punish for so long, if they start to engage in that positive behavior again, if you really were consistent with your punishment, you're not supposed to go back on it, because then they start to learn, punishment only lasts for like half the time, because eventually I'll get it back. It's best to just try it, but it can even be shorter periods of time. We'll try again in an hour. You're having a hard time right now. But you want, like we said, we're focusing so much on the positive reinforcement. Kids want to know that you're not going to hold this against them forever. This is something that, they're struggling with these behaviors. You're trying to teach them new behaviors. They're learning new behaviors, and they're going to make mistakes. We all make mistakes, and we want them to understand that, that's okay. We'll try again. Right, because you're trying to figure out where, in the continuum of ADHD behaviors, from maybe the more minimal things are like fidgetiness, to all the way up to like hitting others. Is that sort of what you're talking about? And you're not sure, my son has ADHD. Am I being too harsh and focusing on that thing versus other things? Now, I think your gut's probably telling you when he's hitting other children, that's something that you're going to pay attention to. That's something you're going to intervene on. But there is that concept of choosing your battles for things, and there are some just really mild behaviors where maybe if the kid is still paying attention to you, but they're maybe fidgeting a little bit with something in their hand, we're going to say, you know what, I'm not going to make a battle over that. There's a lot of other things that I'm going to choose as my target behaviors to focus on and to reinforce or to punish or to ignore. And oftentimes it's helpful just to ignore a lot of the minimal behaviors that aren't affecting other people. So safety is always priority. If someone is getting hit or your son is doing something dangerous, like running out into the street, we don't want to say, well, am I being too harsh? Because there's a possible danger element to that. So safety is always top priority. And then if it's affecting other people, that kind of goes up high on that list as well. But there are some kind of minor behaviors that we could say, it's not that big of a deal. And you can always decide, well, I'm going to work on these other, you can prioritize what you work on. I'm going to work on these other ones first. When I get a good handle on the hitting and the kicking, and that's really kind of washed out, then I'll start to focus on more of these minor behaviors. But if you added everything into that mix of, well, I'm just going to go after everything, it totally is. Yeah.
The only thing I would add to that is if your gut is telling you, or you're getting that sensation that I might be being too rough, too harsh, or too negative with my child, I think that that's your signal that I may not be reinforcing enough. I may not be hitting that 4-to-1 ratio. And one of the best ways that we can hit that 4-to-1 reinforcement to punishment ratio is to increase the rates of reinforcement. And the simplest way that we have to do that is to pay more attention and give more attention statements contingent on just okay behavior. So the really simple things that can happen relatively frequently, that often fly under the radar, are the things that we can pay attention to all the time. And in doing so, we create that better balance. And we actually start to hear ourselves as parents say okay things about our child instead of thinking that we're always correcting this, correcting that, stop doing this, come over here, why'd you do that? How many times have I told you to do X? But when you start saying things like you're sitting nicely at the table, when you're driving in the car and your child's showing decent behavior, just engaging in a conversation with them, talking to them about something of interest, giving them statements contingent on their okay behavior while they're sitting in the car. Because if they're sitting in the car reading a book, or they're looking out the window, or they're listening to the music, those are the sorts of things that we take for granted because they're not bugging us. And we pay attention to them when they are yelling in the car, or pulling on their siblings, whatever, or talking when we're trying to talk to someone else. That's when we pay attention to them. And if you really want to, if you want to change that tide, if you will, you start paying attention to the behavior that you're not right now. And that's the way we can create that balance. Well, it's one of the more challenging things to work with. Keep in mind that probably a significant influence on what you're describing is when a child has ADHD, one of their primary weaknesses is behavioral control. And when you get emotionally aroused, like you get to some place that excites you, like a playground, or something really angers you, your baseline ability to control your behavior diminishes already. And then if you already don't have very good behavioral control, it goes down even further. So I think you're describing what you should understand as a challenging situation. Also, social interactions are the thing where parents have the least amount of influence typically. Unless you hover around your child, you take them everywhere, and you tell them you're whispering in their ear all the time while they're interacting with another child. You're struggling to influence your child's social behavior. Some things that we try to coach parents to do is to give their child 1 or 2 key things to focus on, like keep your hands to yourself. Use it if it's an indoor play date. Use an indoor voice. If you're having someone come over to play, take turns, but nothing too complicated. Just a couple key things. Practice with them. Practice that behavior with them. Practice taking turns when you're playing a game. Give them feedback. Demonstrate what taking turns really looks like. And then when they're in a social situation where you can observe them, give them a reminder before they enter the situation. What are their goals, for instance, and give them, tell them, if you do this, then this will be a reward. So if you do a good job taking turns when Billy comes over, after Billy leaves, we'll go get water ice. To give them some kind of incentive to try to demonstrate a behavior that is very hard for them to do. Oftentimes, these kids need more external influence over their behavior because their internal resources to manage that and modulate that aren't as strong. These are children and teens who have a slower rate of becoming independent in the things that we think are age appropriate for them to have independence. I think just understanding and accepting that helps kind of guide what you're doing. I think what you're going through is quite common because you're preparing your youngster for high school, and there's a greater degree of independence that's going to be expected. probably needs more guidance, support, and oversight than you think. And it's important to provide it, yet always continually trying to move, look for the future, move forward to the future, start to take away little parts of support. I would not imagine that, not that I would not imagine, but I think having an expectation that when he comes home and no one's home, that he's going to get started on his homework. Unless, you had cameras installed all over the house, and you could watch it from your phone or your work, and you could talk to him in the house and say, "I see you." I really, which is creepy, by the way, but potentially effective. I don't think you're going to have a lot of influence, so I wouldn't even, not that I wouldn't even try, but that's probably, you're setting up a fail. Also, and I don't think it's unfair to expect an 8th grader to write down their homework. So to set that as a behavioral goal, and whatever, you may get some video game time before I get home from work, and you may just want to drive faster. But anything beyond that is going to be contingent on you have your homework assignments written in your assignment book. It matches what the teacher puts online. Your homework is started when we say the start. Your homework is done by a goal time. Those are all things that get you either more video game time or whatever, or there's only certain video games that you can play in that free time, but the really good ones, that's what you get to earn. You have to get, just getting more creative sometimes is required. But there are some things where you just, if no one's home, I don't know. I don't think homework's going to get started independently. I mean, you can try, and you could set up a reward where, if I get home and this amount of homework is done, then you get some other reward. You can do that too. You can set up a contingency that tries to influence the behavior when you're not around. Well, on behalf of Dr. Proctor, we want to thank you.